Imagine finally achieving your ultimate dream. The house you've worked your entire life for as a successful real estate entrepreneur in a community that feels like paradise. But what if that dream turned into a nightmare? What if the very people who were supposed to welcome you tried to push you out simply because you're a black man who dared to achieve that dream? Get ready for the unbelievable true story of David Evans, a man who bought his slice of the American dream only to find himself in a battle against prejudice and hypocrisy, and a Karen who had no idea she was about to face the biggest surprise of her life. For years, David Evans carried a vision in his heart. A sprawling two-story home, maybe brick, nestled on a neatly trimmed lot, with a wraparound porch, a spacious backyard, and the kind of quiet elegance that whispered of peace and hard-won success. It was more than just a house. It was the embodiment of a dream meticulously built brick by painstaking brick through years of grinding work, late nights and sacrifices that only those who've truly climbed can understand. He'd seen the glossy brochures driven past the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates in Georgia, and promised himself one day that would be his. And then finally, that day came. The moving truck, a triumphant beast of a vehicle, rumbled its way down the pristine streets of Willow Creek, carrying not just furniture, but years of accumulated hope and the quiet dignity of arrival. David stood on his new driveway, breathing in the scent of fresh-cut grass and possibility. This was it. This was everything he'd envisioned. Peaceful, elegant, perfect, but almost immediately something felt off. The moving boxes were still piled high, yet David noticed the eyes. Peeking from behind curtains, watching from porches, lingering a second too long as neighbors walked their dogs. No one approached. No friendly introductions. No welcome to the neighborhood. Just a curious, unsettling silence. At first he brushed it off. Maybe people here just kept to themselves. Maybe they'd warm up over time, he thought, trying to quell a tiny flicker of unease. It's a common mistake, isn't it? We often dismiss those initial red flags, those subtle nudges from our intuition, as just someone being particular or overly organized. We want to believe the best to fit in to justify what feels slightly off, but sometimes that seemingly innocuous behavior is just the very thin end of a much larger, more insidious wedge. The first undeniable sign that wouldn't happen came the very next morning. David had barely finished brewing his coffee, the rich aroma filling his new kitchen, when a sharp, insistent knock rattled his front door. He opened it to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She was dressed impeccably. A neatly pressed beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a small official-looking pin with the HOA emblem clipped onto her cardigan. Her posture was rigid, her expression neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something David couldn't quite place. A cold, assessing gaze. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped almost surgical. "I'm Eleanor Vance, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." David, ever the gentleman, extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." I know who you are," she interrupted, her gaze sweeping past him into the house as if taking inventory. "I wanted to go over a few things." From that initial icy welcome, the paper trail began. It wasn't a trickle, it was a deluge. Almost daily, another crisp white envelope would appear in David's mailbox, each one a fresh assault on his peace of mind. Violation notice. The heading screamed, usually in bold, officious letters. The offenses. His lawn, just mowed the day before, was deemed improperly edged. His newly installed porch light, stylish and energy efficient, was not compliant with community aesthetic guidelines. His trash bins, put out exactly as instructed, were visible from the street outside of designated collection hours. It was maddening. A constant low hum of irritation bubbling just beneath his skin. He'd painstakingly read the HOA rulebook, cross-referencing every detail, and still the notices kept coming. He'd comply, of course. He'd trim his edges until they were razor sharp, swap out the light fixture wheel, his bins back the instant the garbage truck passed. But the mental toll was immense. Imagine living under a microscope, every tiny detail of your life scrutinized not for actual infractions, but for the mere possibility of one. It felt like he was being slowly, methodically bled dry of his spirit, one paper cut at a time. What made it even more insidious was the glaring hypocrisy. David would walk his dog in the evenings trying to clear his head, and he'd see the overflowing trash bins left out for days on Willow Lane, the lawns on Evergreen Drive that looked more like untamed jungles, the faded peeling paint on houses just 2 doors down from his. Yet he never saw a single violation notice on their doors. It was a stark, undeniable contrast. This wasn't about upholding community standards. It was about upholding a standard for him. And that's the painful reality, isn't it? When the rules only seem to apply to you when the enforcement is selective and biased, it's never really about the rules. It's always about control, about power, and about who gets to decide who belongs. The whispers in the neighborhood grew louder, though never directly addressed to David. He'd try to offer a friendly wave, a polite nod, and conversations would instantly die down. Smiles would tighten. Doors would close a little too quickly. He felt like an anomaly, an unwelcome variable in their carefully curated equation. He began to feel isolated, despite living in a thriving community. It's a chilling experience to be invisible, yet constantly watched, to be alone in a sea of people. His suspicion solidified into an unshakable certainty. This wasn't just Eleanor Vance being particular. This was a targeted campaign. So David decided to run a little experiment, a quiet test of his own. He deliberately left his trash bins out for an extra hour after collection, just to see what would happen. And sure enough, like clockwork the next morning, a fresh violation notice was tucked into his mailbox. Later that day, he noticed Mrs. Henderson's bins still sitting at the curb from the previous day's collection, but no notice for her. He had his proof. This wasn't a game to be played by their rules. This was a battle, and David realized he needed an equally ruthless ally. That's when he picked up the phone and called Joe Martinez, a real estate attorney with a reputation for being as sharp as a tack, as relentless as a bulldog, and twice as ruthless as Eleanor Vance ever hoped to be. David was tired of being on the defensive. It was time to go on the offensive. And Eleanor Vance, in her meticulously pressed blouse and pearl earrings, had no idea what storm she had just unleashed. The constant stream of violation notices was maddening, but what came next was an audacious leap into pure absurdity. David was in his home office, sifting through emails from his real estate business, when another knock echoed through the house. He opened the door to find Eleanor Vance, her posture as stiff as ever. But this time her face wore a thinly veiled expression of triumph. "Mr. Evans," she began, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "We've received several complaints from your neighbors about unusual activity at this residence, specifically concerns about fraudulent occupancy." David's jaw tightened. He almost laughed. Fraudulent occupancy. In his own house, he'd bought this place fair and square with cash he'd earned. The sheer audacity of her claim, implying he was a squatter or some kind of illicit renter, was staggering. It felt like she was trying to gaslight him to make him doubt his own reality. But beneath the initial shock, a cold clarity settled over him. He knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about neighbors' complaints. It was about trying to discredit him, to paint him as an outsider who didn't belong, someone easily dismissed. And that's the insidious nature of accusations, isn't it? Baseless claims can be weaponized. They don't need evidence. They just need a narrative. Historically, and even in our modern world, marginalized communities often face this exact tactic, being questioned about their legitimacy in spaces they rightfully occupy. It's a subtle form of violence designed to wear you down, to make you question yourself. Eleanor wasn't just accusing him. She was attempting to erase him from the fabric of Willow Creek Estates. "So, Mr. Evans," Eleanor continued, seemingly emboldened by his momentary silence, "the HOA board requires immediate proof of ownership. The deed to this property, if you please." Her tone was dismissive, as if he were a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. David looked at her, then calmly replied, "Barbara, I'm the homeowner. My name is on the deed." He knew exactly what this was. He didn't ask any other neighbors for proof of homeownership, just him. He could have exploded. He could have shown her the deed right there and then thrown it in her smug face. But David wasn't just angry. He was strategic. He knew giving her the immediate satisfaction would be a loss. He needed to play a longer game, a more devastating one. He kept his composure, a calm that unnerved her. Later that week, while driving through the neighborhood, David saw Eleanor deep in conversation with a man in khakis pointing animatedly towards David's house. He overheard snippets. "Get rid of him. No place here." It was all the confirmation he needed. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was a conspiracy. And it was time to unleash Joe Martinez. David's meeting with Joe was brief, focused, and utterly precise. Joe listened intently as David laid out the entire timeline. The endless violation notices, the blatant hypocrisy, Eleanor's demand for proof of ownership. When David finished, Joe leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "So," Joe said, "she wants to play hardball, huh? Well, David, sometimes the best defense is a devastating offense." And with that, a plan cunning and unexpected began to form. A plan that would not only expose Eleanor Vance, but would also turn the very tables she thought she controlled against her in a way she could never ever see coming. This wasn't just about proving ownership. It was about revealing a secret so profound, so ironic, it would shake Willow Creek Estates to its very foundations. The night of the emergency HOA meeting crackled with an almost palpable tension. The community room, usually a sterile space for mundane discussions, was packed. Whispers snaked through the chairs, heads turned, as David walked in a quiet buzz, following him like a shadow. Eleanor Vance sat at the head of the long table, impeccably composed, a faint, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. She had assembled her board, lined up her witnesses, the quiet, complicit neighbors, and she clearly believed she held all the cards. Eleanor cleared her throat, about to launch into her carefully rehearsed condemnation, when David's voice, calm but firm, cut through the expectant silence. "Excuse me, Ms. Vance," he said, stepping forward. All eyes snapped to him. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, surprised by his audacity. "I believe there's a matter of immediate concern that needs to be addressed before we proceed with whatever this is." A ripple went through the room. Eleanor, visibly annoyed, tried to assert control. "Mr. Evans, we are here to discuss your ongoing issues with HOA compliance. You will have your turn." "My turn will be now." David countered his voice, gaining a quiet authority that brooked no argument. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, legal-looking document. "First, let's address the absurd claim of fraudulent occupancy." He walked directly to the board table, not to Eleanor, but to Stephen Reynolds, the vice president, who looked visibly uncomfortable. "This," David announced, placing the document firmly on the table, "is the deed to my house at 142 Willow Creek Drive. Signed, sealed, and delivered. I am unequivocally the legal homeowner." A collective murmur rose from the crowd. Neighbors exchanged glances. Eleanor's self-satisfied smile flickered a tiny crack in her facade. But David wasn't done. This was merely the overture. He then pulled out a second document, equally official, equally imposing. "And for those who might be concerned about unusual activity in the neighborhood," he continued, his voice echoing with an almost chilling calmness, "I also recently acquired another property within Willow Creek Estates. Number 210 Oakwood Drive, actually. Just a few blocks over." The murmurs grew louder. People started to lean forward, sensing a deeper game at play. And then he held up a third document. This one he held aloft for everyone to see, a triumphant banner. He looked directly at Eleanor Vance, whose face was slowly draining of all color. "And this," David declared, his voice cutting through the tension, "is the deed for 216 Oakwood Drive." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing the realization to dawn on everyone. "Barbara," he said, his voice now a quiet, devastating hammer blow. "That's your house." A gasp rippled through the room, followed by a stunned, almost deafening silence. It was a plot twist no one, especially not Eleanor, had seen coming. The woman who had spent weeks, months, trying to have him removed from his own property had just found out in front of the entire community that her own house belonged to him. And she hadn't even known. Let that sink in for a moment. The meticulous controlling HOA president, so obsessed with others' compliance, had let her own financial situation deteriorate to the point where her home was foreclosed upon and sold at auction. An auction she had apparently ignored. That's the shocking irony, isn't it? That foreclosure you ignored the property sale that went through last month. I was the buyer. It highlights a painful truth. True power isn't about what you think you control through rules and intimidation, but what you truly own. Literally and figuratively, Eleanor in her arrogance had been so busy trying to diminish David, she'd lost sight of the ground beneath her own feet. The mic drop moment arrived as David looked directly at Eleanor, his gaze unwavering. "So tell me, Barbara," he asked, his voice laced with the quiet satisfaction of justice. "Who's the real trespasser now?" The room erupted. The game for Eleanor Vance was officially over. The gasp that rippled through the room was deafening. Eleanor Vance's face, which moments before had held such smug certainty, was now a mask of pure shock, draining of all color. She sputtered, attempting to form words, but none came. Her carefully constructed facade had just crumbled, revealing the desperate woman beneath. The air was thick with disbelief. Then, a low murmur started growing into a hum as people looked from David to the speechless HOA president. "Fraudulent occupancy." David's voice cut through the noise, calm and devastating. He gestured to the crumpled complaint Eleanor had tried to present. "This document claims numerous complaints from neighbors. Funny, because I spoke to several neighbors before this meeting. No one seems to recall expressing any concerns about my residency. Perhaps those complaints exist only in your imagination, Ms. Vance." He didn't wait for her to respond. He wasn't debating. He was delivering a verdict. He then pulled out a stack of his own meticulously documented complaints. Complaints he had filed against actual verifiable violations by other residents. "I filed formal complaints about broken shutters on Elm Street, overgrown lawns on Birchwood Lane, trash bins left out for days on Sycamore Drive. None of them," he stated, his voice rising slightly, "resulted in violation notices. Tell me, members of the board," he challenged, turning to Stephen Reynolds and the other bewildered directors, "do these rules only apply when Barbara feels like enforcing them, or when the person is someone like me?" The silence that followed was heavy with guilt. Stephen Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. The other board members looked at their laps at the ceiling anywhere but at Eleanor. The hypocrisy was laid bare, undeniable. But David wasn't finished. He had one final brutal truth to expose. "And finally," he said, producing a printout from his briefcase, "let's talk about accountability, Ms. Vance. As the president of the HOA, you're supposed to set an example. Yet according to these records from the association's own ledger, you, Eleanor Vance, owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees. Fees, I might add, that contributed to the very financial issues that led to the foreclosure of your own property." The collective gasp this time was punctuated by gasps, chuckles, and outright guffaws. Mr. Henderson, a longtime resident known for his quiet nature, stood up. "You really tried to evict the man who owns your house," he boomed, disbelief coloring his voice. The irony was too rich, the justice too poetic. Eleanor Vance, the queen of rules, the arbiter of order, was caught red-handed not just as a hypocrite, but as someone who couldn't even manage her own affairs. Her face contorted. All the composure, the rigid self-control shattered. She slammed her hand on the table, knocking over a water glass. "This is outrageous!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury and humiliation. "You have no right. This is a personal attack." "It's the truth, Ms. Vance," David said simply. "And the truth often hurts." Stephen Reynolds, visibly shaken, but now emboldened by the undeniable evidence and the public outcry, cleared his throat. "Given the overwhelming evidence presented tonight," he announced, his voice firmer than it had been all evening, "and the clear abuse of authority, I move that Eleanor Vance be immediately removed as president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." A sea of hands shot up, almost unanimous. "By a majority vote," Stephen declared, his voice ringing with newfound confidence, "Eleanor Vance is officially removed as president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, effective immediately." Eleanor stared aghast. Her world had just imploded. She stood frozen for a moment. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room. The sharp click of her heels, echoing the sound of her authority, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Not a single person followed her. Justice, cold and swift, had been served. And for David, this wasn't just a victory. It was a profound lesson in how the truth, when weaponized with strategic brilliance, can bring down even the most entrenched prejudiced power. 6. The aftermath and the new dawn building. A better community. Eleanor Vance stormed out of that HOA meeting, her heels clicking a furious rhythm against the tiled floor, leaving behind a silence so thick you could almost taste it. No one moved. No one spoke. The board members, including Stephen Reynolds, shifted uncomfortably, as if finally realizing they had hitched themselves to the wrong wagon. David, however, simply sat back, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over him. The immediate battle was won. Then slowly the murmurs began. "Can you believe that?" someone whispered. "She tried to evict the wrong guy." Another chuckled. Stephen Reynolds, regaining his composure, cleared his throat. "Well," he started adjusting his tie awkwardly. "I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled." Mishandled, David thought, a small wry smile playing on his lips. That was certainly one way to put it. But David wasn't just interested in personal victory. He had bought into this community literally and figuratively, and he intended to make it better. "Since we're still here," he announced, addressing the board, "let's discuss actual HOA violations." He picked up his list, the same one Eleanor had ignored for weeks. Broken fences, trash bins left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these violations exist right now, but somehow I was the only one receiving fines. And he then formally filed a complaint against Eleanor Vance for harassment, falsifying HOA complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority for personal grievances. The board, chastened and now eager to prove their impartiality, promised a thorough review and swift action. The neighborhood, once a place of subtle whispers and averted gazes, began to change. It wasn't immediate, of course. Some neighbors still avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their silence, by their complicity in Eleanor's reign of quiet terror. But others, slowly, tentatively, began to make an effort. One afternoon, Lisa Carter, a middle-aged woman who lived 3 houses down and had been one of the few to vote against Eleanor, walked up David's driveway with a plate of homemade cookies. "I know it's late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but welcome to the neighborhood." David smiled, accepting the plate. "Took you long enough." He chuckled, and Lisa laughed, a little sheepish. "Yeah, it did." It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning. It showed that even after silence, there can be a path to reconciliation. It reminded David that while prejudice can be loud and destructive, genuine community is built on quiet acts of courage and the willingness to acknowledge past wrongs. It's a painful but necessary lesson. The responsibility for a community's health doesn't just rest with the loudest voices, but with every single person who chooses to speak up or chooses to stay silent. As for Eleanor Vance, she didn't take defeat lightly, but she had no choice. A month later, the for sale sign went up in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. She had refused to buy back the house at David's market price, and no bank would give her a loan for the amount she needed. She and her husband Richard packed up and left in the middle of the night, moving to a smaller place across town. Her reign of control was over, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The neighborhood truly transformed after that. Without Eleanor in charge, the HOA actually started working the way it was supposed to, addressing real issues instead of policing nonsense. And David, he continued to thrive not just as a homeowner, but as an integral part of a community that was finally learning to see beyond superficial differences. David often reflected on the entire ordeal. Some people, he realized, spend their entire lives trying to control others. They believe their power comes from rules, from status, from making others feel small. But real power, he knew, now that comes from knowing who you are, from standing firm in your truth, and from refusing to let anyone take that away from you. It's the power of resilience, the power of self-respect, And the power of knowing that your worth is inherent, not granted by any HOA president or any set of arbitrary rules. And that, my friends, is a lesson worth fighting for, a lesson worth living by. Because trust me, there's plenty more where this came from. David's story reminds us that true power isn't about control or status, but about knowing your worth and standing firm in your truth. As a black man in real estate, David navigated not only the complexities of his business, but also the insidious layers of prejudice. It's about finding your voice, even when the world tries to silence you. And sometimes it's about playing the long game to achieve real justice. If David's resilience inspired you, if you've ever faced unfairness and fought back, hit that subscribe button. Join our community where we share stories of overcoming adversity and proving that the underdog can always triumph. Because trust me, there are plenty more powerful stories where this came from.